July 5, 1950. American bazooka rounds hit a North Korean tank and simply bounce off. Near Osan, Korea, these soldiers had no idea their weapons were already obsolete before the fight began. This was Task Force Smith, the first American ground unit thrown against the invading North Korean army. 5 weeks earlier, North Korea had invaded South Korea with Soviet tanks rolling across the 38th parallel. President Truman ordered American troops from occupation duty in Japan to rush south and stop them. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith commanded 406 men, hastily pulled from soft occupation postings. These soldiers had spent years on garrison duty, marching in parades, not training for real combat. Post-war budget cuts had gutted the Army, leaving units under strength and poorly equipped for 1950. Their anti-tank weapon was the 2.36-inch bazooka, a design left over from World War II. That bazooka could punch through older Japanese and German armor, but Korea brought a different enemy. North Korea's spearhead was the Soviet T-34, a tank with thick, sloped steel armor. That sloped armor deflected shells, a design lesson the Soviets learned fighting Germany years earlier. On July 5th, Task Force Smith dug in on a ridge north of Osan, waiting. Rain and low clouds grounded American air support, stripping away their one clear advantage. At 7:45 in the morning, 33 T-34 tanks appeared, rumbling down the road toward them. American artillery opened fire first, but most shells only chipped the tank's thick frontal armor. Only 6 high-explosive anti-tank rounds were on hand, and even those failed to stop the column. A young lieutenant fired 22 bazooka rounds directly at the tanks from close range. Nearly every round struck the tank's rear and sides, the thinnest armor on the entire vehicle. Still, the rounds barely dented the steel, and the tanks kept rolling forward without slowing. The bazooka's shaped charge simply could not penetrate armor this thick at this range. Some tanks rolled straight over American foxholes, crushing communication lines and scattering the defenders. Within 20 minutes, the tank column had broken straight through Task Force Smith's entire defensive line. And the tanks were only the first wave. Thousands of North Korean infantry followed close behind. With the ridge overrun, Colonel Smith ordered his infantry to fall back to a second defensive position. But North Korean infantry, following close behind the tanks, quickly began flanking both sides of the line. Smith's men had only enough ammunition for a short engagement, not a sustained battle against thousands. Radios failed in the rain, and runners had to carry orders on foot across open, exposed ground. By mid-morning, Smith realized his position was no longer a defense, but a slow collapse. He gave the order to withdraw, but by then the enemy had surrounded much of his force. The retreat quickly turned chaotic, as units lost contact with one another in the confusion. Wounded men were left behind because there was no organized way to carry them out safely. Some soldiers discarded boots and equipment, simply to move faster through the muddy terrain. By the time the fighting ended, Task Force Smith had lost around 150 men. That was roughly a third of the entire force Smith had brought north from Japan. Survivors scattered across the countryside, some walking for days to reach friendly lines again. The battle at Osan lasted barely 7 hours from first contact to final withdrawal. Yet that short delay was exactly what American commanders desperately needed at that moment. Every hour North Korea's advance was slowed, gave reinforcements more time to reach the peninsula. Behind Task Force Smith, more American units were rushing south from Japan by ship and plane. General Douglas MacArthur had ordered Task Force Smith forward specifically to slow the North Korean advance. He knew these troops were outmatched, but he needed time more than he needed victory. This strategy became known as trading space and blood for the time commanders desperately needed. Task Force Smith was only the first of several delaying actions fought that summer in Korea. American and South Korean forces kept falling back, buying time toward a final defensive perimeter. That perimeter, around the port city of Osan, would become the last line before total defeat. Without the hours bought at Osan, that final defense might never have had time to form. But back in Washington, the defeat at Osan forced a painful question about America's true readiness. Army leaders had to explain how occupation duty had left combat units so badly unprepared for war. Investigators traced the failure back to years of shrinking defense budgets after World War II ended. Between 1945 and 1950, the Army's active strength had fallen by more than half. Training time was cut short, and live-fire exercises were rare across most occupation units in Japan. Many soldiers had never fired their own weapons in realistic field conditions before reaching Korea. The bazooka failure at Osan became a symbol of a much larger equipment problem across the Army. Newer anti-tank weapons existed on paper, but few had reached frontline units by the summer of 1950. A more powerful 3.5-inch bazooka had already been developed, but sat unissued in American depots. That weapon could pierce the T-34's armor, but it arrived in Korea only weeks after Osan. Once fielded, the newer bazooka finally began stopping North Korean tanks in later engagements that summer. But that improvement came only after other units paid the same price Task Force Smith had paid. General MacArthur's headquarters had underestimated North Korea's armored strength before the invasion even began. Intelligence reports had noted Soviet tanks in North Korea, but their true numbers were never confirmed. Some American planners believed any Soviet-style tank could be handled with existing World War II weapons. That assumption proved disastrously wrong the moment the T-34s reached the ridge outside Osan. Congressional hearings later examined why American forces had been sent into battle so poorly equipped. Task Force Smith's ordeal pushed Washington to accelerate rearmament across the entire United States military. Defense spending, which had been slashed for years, rose sharply within months of the Korean War's start. New tanks, better anti-tank weapons, and additional troops began flowing toward Korea within weeks. For Lieutenant Colonel Smith, the battle left a lasting weight he carried for the rest of his career. Smith later said he never expected to fight tanks with a weapon that could not stop them. Historians today view Osan not as a tactical blunder, but as a symptom of national unpreparedness. The men of Task Force Smith did exactly what their orders demanded, even without the tools to succeed. Their sacrifice at Osan became one of the opening chapters in a war that would last 3 years. After Osan, the delaying strategy repeated itself again and again across the Korean peninsula that summer. At Chochiwon, then Chonan, then Daejeon, American units fought short battles and fell back again. Each battle bought a few more days, and each day mattered more than commanders could say publicly. By early August, North Korean forces had pushed American and South Korean troops into a small corner. That corner, the Osan perimeter, stretched roughly 140 miles around the vital port. Inside that perimeter, reinforcements and supplies finally began arriving faster than the enemy could exploit gaps. Fresh tanks, new bazookas, and additional infantry divisions poured through the port in growing numbers. The Osan perimeter held through August and into September, despite repeated North Korean assaults along the line. That defensive stand gave General MacArthur the time he needed to plan a much bolder move. On September 15th, American forces launched a surprise amphibious landing far behind enemy lines at Incheon. This landing cut supply lines to North Korean troops still fighting far south around the Pusan perimeter. Within weeks, North Korean forces were retreating north, and Seoul was recaptured by American and South Korean troops. The tide of the war had turned, but the delaying fight at Osan made that turn possible. Historians still debate whether Task Force Smith should ever have been sent forward so thinly equipped. Some argue the delay was worth the cost, while others call it an avoidable, needless sacrifice. What is not disputed is that Task Force Smith exposed real gaps in America's post-war readiness. Those lessons reshaped how the United States trained, equipped, and prepared its military for decades afterward. Never again would the Army allow occupation duty to substitute for genuine combat readiness on this scale. The 3.5-inch bazooka became standard issue, and tank doctrine was rewritten based on Osan's failures. Task Force Smith is now studied at military academies as a case study in unpreparedness and its costs. The term Task Force Smith itself became military shorthand for sending troops in unready for the fight ahead. Decades later, Pentagon planners still invoke Osan whenever readiness budgets face proposed cuts in peacetime. For the men who survived Osan, the memory of that ridge never faded from their later lives. Many returned to Osan decades later, walking the same ground where their unit had been overrun. For those veterans, Osan was not a footnote in a textbook, but the day everything changed. Task Force Smith's story reminds us that readiness, not courage alone, decides who survives the first battle. If this history matters to you, subscribe to Colonel Mittens for more true stories from forgotten fronts. Every battle has a lesson buried in it. We'll keep digging until it's told right.